So today we are going to take a look at Free Will by Sam Harris. This is a rather short and brief introduction to his arguments on free will, which are that it doesn't exist. And he argues that it doesn't exist on two bases. The first has to do with his background in neuroscience, which is that he argues that for their experiments where for simple motor functions, um, they can pinpoint the neural correlate to the physical activity. So let's say like moving your arm. They found the place in the brain that corresponds to moving your arm. And what they found is when you decide to move your arm, the area in your brain fires for moving your arm before you are consciously aware of you're deciding of moving your arm. And what this seems to imply is that you, in a sense, you've already made the decision before you've made the decision, or the decision has arose within you. And Sam Harris argues that the decision isn't really yours if it's made before you're even consciously aware of it. And he seems to imply that it's only a matter of time before um, like we don't have the neural coordinates for more complex decisions, but he thinks that that's just a matter of time and science. Um, this is largely his first objection to free will, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so it's kind of hard to disagree with it in a content oriented way. But um, I know that there are issues with consciousness, and that the neural coordinates of all conscious activity are not particularly well mapped, and there's issues regarding mapping things versus internal experience and bridging that gap, and it's complex, and so. But I think that argument's interesting, um, and certainly I would be interested to see if more complex functions you have the decision occurring before it becomes manifest in your mind. The second objection to free will is largely on an understanding of causality, which for him, um, you don't really cause any of your actions. Instead, your environment and your biology cause them. And I object somewhat to this argument. I think if you accept his understanding of causality, the argument rather well follows, and that the point at which you could make an objection is that his understanding of causality, I think, leads to an infinite regress. And so, whenever someone does something, you ask what caused it, and it's like, oh, it's the environment and their biology. And what caused the environment and their biology? Oh, the factors that led to it. And so, in that sense, what we use the word to refer to can't actually accurately refer to anything. If you think if the cause of everything is just the cause of those causes, then you can't really point to anything except for something preceding the Big Bang, I know not what, or um, a first mover. Um, and so, but if you do accept his understanding or his definition of causality, the argument's pretty good. And I think he does it in a really good way. He presents the information very well. I rather enjoyed reading it, even though I don't necessarily agree with his conclusion. And a third point he makes, which I think is probably the most interesting thing in the book, largely because the topic of free will is something I've already read quite a bit about, is that he makes an argument for the utility of believing that free will doesn't exist. And he does this for a more compassionate view on punishment, which I think he kind of hits the nail on the head quite a bit, because I have reservations as to whether or not free will exists. And I think that the point he makes is good, is that if people's biology and their environment is what's the cause of their action, it's difficult, in a sense, to view them as evil when they commit bad actions. Instead, they're just unlucky to have been dealt the hand that leads to them being a criminal or problematic in some way. And what Harris argues is that we should be more compassionate in regards to how we think of and enact and view punishment, Because if someone ultimately isn't responsible for their behavior in some way, then punishment is punitive. He makes the point that, as insofar as punishment is a deterrent, is actually something we should keep doing. But if it's not going to act like a deterrent, he seems to be of the opinion that we just shouldn't be engaged in punishment. And I think that he makes a fairly good point of it. If someone is not responsible for their action, uh, if they're the victim of circumstance, then it hardly seems reasonable to punish them. And the example he gives that I think is really good is he talks about he gives like four different types of people, and each have varying degrees of how responsible they could be considered, and they all commit the same crime. I don't remember all four. I think one is like a 6-year-old child shoots someone with a gun. How responsible should we hold them? And then one on the other end of the spectrum is like an adult who just kills someone just because they felt like it. That one being the one we should hold most responsible. And another interesting one is someone had a tumor in their frontal lobe, which controls their ability to self-regulate in any meaningful way. And it's Harris's argument is that we wouldn't be really wanting to hold the person with the brain tumor wholly accountable for their actions. And if they get the brain tumor removed, perhaps they could return as a functioning member of society. By the same token, and the reason why is because the brain tumor acts on them in a way they have no control over. In the same token, one's environment and biology acts on them in an analogous way, according to Harris. And okay, I think that there is a little bit of a rejoinder, or like I think Harris, if he's going to make the argument that not believing in free will has positive benefit, he should also look at the other side of the coin, where does believing in free will have utility as well? I imagine that believing in free will would lead to higher degrees of persistence and less learned helplessness, although I haven't seen any literature on that. But overall, I liked the book quite a bit. It got an overall rating of 6.29. So let's jump into the ratings real quick. For utility, I gave it a 5. It's pretty abstract and theoretical, so it's unclear to what degree any of it's implementable. But at the same time, the book is very short, and so it's fairly information dense and very expedient to read. And I do think that his point regarding punishment is particularly useful. I think, especially in the case of euthanasia, the way that euthanasia should, my opinion, the way it should be evaluated is you remove the person from the society, and then you're indifferent as to whether or not they're killed or just imprisoned for life, and it's cheaper to imprison them for life, so euthanasia is just doesn't make much sense. And he talks about euthanasia a little bit, and I think that that different perspective is what bumps it up in terms of utility to getting something. Also, being able to have an interesting discussion on free will, perhaps, and the book's short, so you don't need a ton of utility in order to get a score of 5. For entertainment, I give it 6.5. He actually incorporates a lot of examples that are not very theoretical. It's not very dense at all, considering it's a book on free will. So I gave it a 6.5. I gave it a 7.5 for interest. I thought he made 2 pretty good arguments for free will not existing, although I disagree with both. Well, I disagree with the logic of both. I'm somewhat tempted to think that free will doesn't exist in a theoretical sense, which is Harris's position. So, for novelty, I give it a 7. If you've never been exposed to ideas of free will before, I think an exposure to a somewhat basic introductory version of it would be useful, and this is that. So, I gave it a 7 on novelty. For style, I gave it a 6. I like the way he incorporates a lot of stories, and also makes the ideas very accessible through examples. I do think he really wanted it for a general audience, and it's generally a type of topic that's not for a general audience, and I think he does a good job making it like that. So perhaps he should have even scored higher on style. I think I put most of my consideration that he did such a good job of that into readability, which I gave him a 7. Um, there was minus points because the physical book, I actually, so it's kind of got like an oversized. It's very very small in terms of page count, and the cover is like bigger than necessary and more floppy than necessary. And then it's also got, and I don't think you can see this very well, it's got the torn, perforated type pages, which, when you're flipping through the book, make it harder to flip accurately, and I find them really annoying. And so I docked him some on readability for that, because it's physically not my favorite book. Um, but, and then for difficulty, I gave it a 5. I don't think he makes it extremely difficult, but it is a somewhat theoretical topic. So I gave him a 5. Overall, 6.29. As far as recommendations go, I would mildly recommend this kind of to everyone a little bit. And then, secondarily, obviously, if you have an interest in free will, but I think it's a useful book for the topic of euthanasia. I also think that the views on punishment are of particular interest if someone has a background in philosophy or criminal justice or something like that. I think that the perspective that punishment, if people aren't responsible for their behavior, that they ought not to be punished, is an important perspective to have, because punishment only makes sense if people are responsible for their behavior. And I think he does a pretty good job for arguing that. So anyone else I would recommend this to. I'm curious to read more of Sam Harris's books. I generally like him as a speaker. I liked the book, but I was mildly disappointed. Just ever so mildly. I don't think I would recommend this to a particularly broad swath of people, but I think that I wouldn't not recommend it to very many people either. I wouldn't be like, oh, that's a terrible book, you shouldn't read it. Because the book was great. I just don't think I'll be recommending it that much. Largely because people don't want to talk about free will, and maybe that's a good thing. I think in general it's more useful to believe that free will exists even if it doesn't. So, anyways, if you liked this, feel free to give it a like or subscribe. If you have an opinion on free will, I'd be more than happy to discuss it in the comments. I think it's an interesting topic. I think Sam Harris puts forth interesting arguments. I think that the first argument is more interesting than the second one, because the second one's just really about what you consider causality. And if you want to have a conversation of the meaning of causality, I think the way he sets it up is, if you accept his notion of causality, which is theoretical, it's pretty hard to object to his point that nothing exists. But also, if I asked you what caused the World Trade Centers to fall, for example, and you told me something preceding the Big Bang, I know not what, I don't think you've done a good job answering my question. But if you allow causality to operate such that there's an infinite regress of responsibility, like if someone's not responsible for their actions because their environment and their genetics, and their environment and their genetics were caused by something else, and that was caused by something else, you go back infinitely. I think that when I ask what the cause of something is, if you just give me the end of that infinite regress, I don't think you've answered my question. And so, okay. But yeah, hope you enjoyed this, and take care.